The IFRC Regional Director for Asia Pacific visited Myanmar last week. Alexander Matheou met with the nation's ministers and reiterated the need for principled humanitarian assistance. And he joins us now this morning on Asia First. Mr. Matheou, let's first start with how your meetings with the country's ministers went last week. What sort of message were you able to convey? And was there any indication of how the military government feels about the humanitarian crisis unfolding in the country?
In every country in the world, there is a Red Cross or Red Crescent society, and Myanmar is no exception. And they are auxiliaries to their authorities. And at the same time, they're obliged to follow certain fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence. I had those meetings in Myanmar because there is a new leadership in the Myanmar Red Cross, and it was important to speak to the authorities, to whom they are auxiliary, about those principles. Because in times of conflict, those principles really are challenged. They become very hard to apply, especially if you're a national organization, because there is mistrust everywhere. Where you're from, where your office is located, who may be influencing you, all those factors may decide whether or not you can be accepted into communities to deliver humanitarian assistance. In those meetings, I tried to underline the importance of an auxiliary that is at the same time neutral, impartial, and independent, and that it should be allowed to access communities across the country, whatever side of front lines they are on. Those discussions, we heard each other. Some assurances about the importance of the Myanmar Red Cross were given, but not a guarantee that we will be given access to all parts of the country, because there are constraints on their ability to provide those assurances. But we heard, I think the messages were heard, at least.
It sounds like an incredibly sort of complex and delicate situation. Get us up to speed, though, having been on the ground, how bad is the current humanitarian situation in Myanmar, and how has it changed since the military coup in February 2021?
Well, I guess some of the figures that you showed a little earlier speak for themselves. Over 18 million people in need of assistance, over 1.5 million people now displaced, large parts of the country inaccessible to humanitarian organizations. And then on top of that, it's a country very prone to natural disasters. Even while I was there was a tornado that destroyed a nearby village. Several people lost their lives. And like across the rest of Southeast Asia, we're seeing more of those extreme weather events. WHO describes Myanmar as one of the worst places in the world to access healthcare, and around 40% of the population are underneath the nation's poverty line. Now, for those who know Myanmar and have known it for some time, will know a lot of that is familiar. It is a country that has experienced conflict for many decades now, and has been isolated from the international community for many, many years. Nevertheless, over the last 2 years, we've seen some things definitely get worse. There is an intensity of fighting in more parts of the country. Consequently, more people are displaced, and it is harder to provide humanitarian assistance. So all of those factors exacerbate the vulnerability for people in Myanmar at the moment.
What do the people in Myanmar need most right now?
Safety, security would always come first. If you live in an area affected by conflict, your life is severely disrupted and dangerous in terms of your men are joining fighting groups, aerial attacks are frequent. It is very difficult to sustain livelihoods or to stay safe in one place, which means you may be forced to move. Once you move, you've lost your independence and you require assistance for the very basics of life: shelter, water, food, etc. So there are extreme needs depending on which parts of the country that you live in and how affected it is by conflict and whether or not you are displaced. But as I mentioned, those are not the only threats making people vulnerable in Myanmar. Broadly speaking, wherever you live, there are challenges around access to health, work, and food security.
And the humanitarian crisis in Myanmar isn't limited to just within its borders either. Bangladesh especially, but even Malaysia too. They're feeling it with sort of the Rohingya fleeing Malaysia. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, there are discussions in Myanmar that some Rohingya may go back from Bangladesh in 2023, probably not large numbers. And there are lots of question marks about it. Will they go voluntarily? And once they arrive, will they live in places where they are allowed to work? Will they have freedom of movement? Or will they live in camp-type conditions, possibly even detention centers? A lot depends on the conditions that people will return to, about whether this is an isolated group that will return or the beginning of something bigger. Beyond that, as you say, there is a broader crisis around the Rohingya in the region, most specifically in Bangladesh, because the conditions in the camps, unfortunately, are beginning to deteriorate. This is often what we see when a crisis hits the headlines, in this case, 5 years ago, and then gradually slips off it. There's a lot of global solidarity at the beginning, and that global solidarity over time goes down, especially if there are other crises in the world attracting attention. So we are seeing less investment to support the Rohingya in Cox's Bazar. As a result, quality of life is deteriorating. As a result, more people are trying to leave, which is creating other crises in terms of rescue at sea and the willingness of neighboring states to provide that service to people who have chosen that option. But for most people in Cox's Bazar, there really are very few options that right now, most cannot go back. You cannot stay and integrate. No other countries really are offering asylum in any significant numbers. You can go to the island of Bhasan Char, but then you might feel even more isolated. You can try to escape, but that is dangerous, or you stay in deteriorating conditions. So that really is one of the biggest crises in the Asia-Pacific region, and one that we must not forget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matheou. We'll have to leave it there. We've been speaking to Alexander Matheou, Asia-Pacific Director of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies.